All right, back for part 2. So we're going to be doing the line weight project based on shadow and light direction. So I got my Rhino printed out, and now I'm going to be heavily looking at the reference because I need to see which of these shapes are shadow, which are light. And there's a thing that I kind of briefly mentioned it in the main line weight lesson, which is that the contrast of value in your line weight is important. And I mentioned it as like, if you're drawing on a dark surface, then a white line shows more contrast. But it goes beyond just the contrast of your line to the paper. Contrast in general is just a really important concept in the visual language. You'll see it repeated in almost everything that you learn. And so when we decide how to indicate the shadow or the light of something, you'll see that a lot of it is actually about the contrast of the values in the picture. It'll make more sense once I start putting it down, but keep that in the back of your head. It's really important. You're going to see it as, contrast of value, contrast of edge, contrast of shapes, big shapes, little shapes, like the contrast between those. Lots of detail, very little detail, areas of rest. That's contrast. Contrast of color. Lots of color in here, very little, lots of grays here, or mostly the thing is green, but then you get that little thing of red right there, and that's contrast. You're going to look at it. Contrast is huge in storytelling and in composition, and form, showing form as well. And so it applies here in a very narrow way, because we don't want to get too complicated yet. But what I mean by it depends on the contrast is, look at the edge of the jaw here. Are we going to indicate the light of the jaw or the shadow of the body, right? Because we said put a heavy line for the shadows and put a light line for the lights. Well, which one is it? Is it the body or the jaw? Like, this line indicates the edge between a dark thing and a light thing. It's kind of both. You have to figure out what you're communicating, right? And the more contrast you have between the shadow and light of that area, the bolder you should probably make it. Again, it doesn't have to be always a dark, thick, sharp line. You don't have to use all three. Sometimes you could say, okay, well, that is the light of the jaw, but there's a lot of contrast. So I'll make it dark, but not thick, right? Because maybe I want to save my dark areas for an area where it's a shadow edge with the background of something, right? Where we're not separating the light and shadow of the same object. And maybe this is a little too complicated, but you kind of can't really avoid it in this picture. One area that is just very clear what you should do is the horn. This side here is a shadow of the horn, right? We're not drawing the background. We're not drawing the sky. We're drawing the rhino. So it's like, okay, let's emphasize the shadow of that horn with a thick line on this side, right? And again, I'm gonna be very, very bold with how heavy I go because this is a line weight demo. I'm gonna really emphasize like the contrast of my line weight. I'm gonna go pretty heavy on this because I know this is a very dark shadow of a prominent object in here. Okay, so there's the shadow. On the other side of the horn, there's light. And there's no contrast here either, right? We have the two concepts actually matching up, where this is light and the background is light. So there's little contrast and it's lit up. So clearly this side of the horn needs to have a light line. And then as it actually goes into the body, now we're actually getting a little bit more contrast, even though it's still lit up. The horn is still lit up, but the contrast now kind of asks us to separate these forms a little bit more, because now we have to indicate the shadow of this horn a little bit more. We can still decide, like, you're the artist, you can choose what you do here, but when you look at it, you definitely feel like this area deserves a thicker line than this area, where the light of the horn kind of gets lost into the light of the sky. And so what we could do is we could provide a dark line here, maybe not as heavy as the one we did here, because we still want to show that this is light of this part, but transition into the light here. And now we get this transition from thick to thin here, back to thick in here, and that kind of gives the horn a little bit of a feeling of glow in that area. It's not actually glowing. It's the best we can do with just outlines using weight. And then as that goes down into the shadow here, that contrast is a lot less because the shadow here is getting a lot of reflection from the sky, and you're seeing blue in here, and that shadow's not nearly as dark. So we could still put a line there, but just, a little bit lighter. And then this edge in here is all inside of a shadow. And so this is where we're talking about the kind of a different combination of these things, where this is indicating a shadow area, but there's no contrast because it's shadow on shadow. So you kind of have to balance it out again. It's like, do we want to show that this is deep within a shadow, or that this is a lot of contrast between something? And again, this is where you are the artist and you can decide. You could maybe keep it thick but not as dark, or dark and thin. It's up to you how you do it. I'm going to make it a little, thick but not nearly as dark as this other stuff. But still, I'm putting a bold line in there because it is within the shadow, and I want to emphasize more of like what's dark and what's light. Same thing, this is shadow of the nose. There's not much contrast there with the background, but I honestly don't really care about the background in here. I'm not drawing the background, and so I'm not going to really consider how much contrast there is between the rhino and the background. It was a nice thing in here just to explain it to you, but it doesn't really matter unless you really are going to be drawing the background as an element. I care more about the fact that this side of the nose is shadow, and this side is light. So when I come back in here, there's actually a lot of contrast in here, but it's light. So I want to make sure that the line in here is a little bit lighter than the line on the outside, but still, not too light because there's contrast. And I'm kind of repeating this over and over again, but I feel like this might be a little confusing for some of you. And remember, I'm not thinking nearly as much about importance and creating a hierarchy of importance in this one. Like the fact that this is an inner form and this is an outer form, I don't really care really that much. I care a little bit just because ideally when you guys are doing your drawings, you are thinking about all this stuff and you're kind of combining them in your own unique ways. Here we're trying to be a little bit more precise with one approach, but sometimes it's really hard to separate them all. But I am being much, much more attentive about the shadow and the light and not about outer forms, inner forms. Now we've come to this part in here where there's areas in here where there's a lot of dark, and then here where there's dark and light and high contrast, and here where there's light and dark and high contrast. So I have to decide which of these do I want to make the most contrasty. This leg back here definitely needs to be heavy because it's the shadow side of the leg. So I'm going to make that pretty thick, but maybe not as dark. It's still dark. It's going to be one of my heaviest lines in the picture. And then this line in here, again, I want to make sure that I'm showing that there's light here. So similar to what I did in the horn, I might transition from thick to thin. So where along this jaw do I want to show the most contrast, and where do I want to show more of a glow? I'm not really sure. I think I could just choose anything. I feel like I'm going to put the most contrast in here, and then maybe a little bit less as I go back here. So I'll make this line a little thinner than the line on the outside that's shadow, but dark. So similar to this in weight. This side of the leg is light, a little bit of shadow actually at the top. So I'll start pretty thick and then I'll taper out, transition to showing more of a light. Even within this little rock over in here, I made the left side of the rock thicker and darker, and then the right side very light. And it kind of looks like a shadow on the left side of that rock. Same with the toe. Left is darker, and then over here there's more light, so I'm keeping that real thin. In here, there's a lot of contrast and there's a lot of shadow in here in this area. There's even that idea of, remember the cast shadow, two areas that are touching, but they're separate. And one kind of casts a shadow onto the other. And showing a thick line there emphasizes that separation between the two things and their shadow there. All the shapes in here are in this shadow. So I'm going to approach it a little bit conservative here, where I'm going to make them thick, but not quite dark just yet, because I want to have a little bit of room to make some of these less heavy than the others. I'm going to jump back up here into the head. Same thing in here. There's a lot of shadow up here. Maybe just the ear has a little bit of light, but then it's not really on the contour. Although I can choose to cheat it a little bit and think of this whole thing as being kind of glowy into the sky. I'll probably do that. Just a little artistic decision. But definitely the horn here, gonna be thick and dark, just like the other horn. It is in shadow. And there's actually a really subtle light on there. So I'll make that a little bit lighter for now. So again, shadow on the left side of the ear, and I'm gonna kind of cheat a little bit more light onto the right side of the ear. So as it goes in this way, lighten it up, and then a little darker again as it comes back into the base or the top of the head. Okay, and as it kind of makes its way over this hump, starts to go into light. Picks up a little bit of contrast on the way down over here, and then tapers off again. I don't like that shape or design in there. It's a little too distracting. The whole ear is in shadow, but there's more contrast on the right side than the left side. So I'm gonna show that. And by the way, like, we're doing all of this without actually shading, without filling in any of the shadows. Once we actually start shading and we're combining line weight with real value within the shadow shapes, the effect together is really strong. On its own, you do get a sense of light and shadow with just the line, but really we're practicing this way of thinking, and then once we start actually adding values in there, it's all gonna come together. Yeah, just letting you know, this doesn't have to be on its own. Like, when you add line weight to a completed drawing, it's just one more element in your storytelling. It's not like the only element. It's just that in this project, we are making it the only element. We're purely focusing on it, but it's just one thing. It is really important to isolate things as we learn any new skill. You focus on one part of the skill and you practice it over and over again until you kind of figure it out. And then you combine it with another thing that you practice for a little bit. And then now you can do two things at once. You can start juggling two balls, and then you add another. But, you know, once you throw in a chainsaw in there, you might want to just practice throwing the chainsaw on itself, by itself, without the other balls that you already know how to juggle. So this nostril here, both sides of the nostril have shadow and light. So what are we emphasizing here? It's really up to me. I'm going to choose to put a darker, more heavy line on this side of the nostril, because it's like a deeper shadow inside. And then as the shadow comes out, I'm saying like it's more in the outside, so it's less deep. All right, and then for all these wrinkles, they're all kind of within the shadow. Like, they all have a little shadow shape around them. But I'm gonna look at the ones, okay, which ones show the most contrast of the bigger form, the bigger shadow. And it's, this outer one shows a lot of contrast between shadow and light. And then this one in here. And then definitely the one inside the eye. And then much less contrast in all these little guys over here. So putting kind of thick lines everywhere in here, but the darkest ones are some of these more contrasty ones. Same thing through all these. They're all within the shadow. Okay, now here, we're actually getting into area of light. So actually, I think I made this one too heavy. These should be really light. Actually, this one's within the shadow. And then right here, this wrinkle, it's within the shadow, and then as it comes out, it gets within shadow and light, but there's a lot of contrast. There's like a deep pocket in here where it's like it gets really dark and there's a highlight on the other side. So it's like one of the most high contrast areas other than this one here. So I'm gonna kind of show that where in this area, I'll go really dark, but not too thick. And then as I come down here into shadow on shadow, there's less contrast, but it's within the shadow. So I'll make it lighter, but thicker. And hopefully this combination kind of communicates some of that with just line. And then actually in here, there's very little contrast. So there is kind of a very light line that continues from this to this, but there's very little shadow or contrast in there. Okay, coming back up here because I almost finished this back, but I went on a side trip. So this whole bump is part of the light. You know, it's exposed to the sun up at the top, so keeping it fairly light. And then right here, I actually see a little bit of a shadow as it wraps around. So I'm gonna start a little bit heavier, and then as it wraps around, I taper it to a lighter. And I could actually do a little bit of that in here as well, as this wraps around to the back. And just a little bit in here as well. Oh, and then forgot about the bottom of the belly here, the chest. That is shadow. Whew! This is a lot of decision making. I don't know, did you guys get brain dead after a while? What the There's a lot of lines to think about. So much analysis. It's pretty draining. This is kind of how I feel after 3 hours of quick sketch, because I'm just like making decision after decision real quick. And my brain just starts to hurt. Lots of contrast in these little toe areas, but again, they're partly in light, so I don't want to make them too bold, except where they're within the shadow. Those I could really push into the shadow. Okay, now let's come into all these little rib shapes, because some of them have pretty heavy shadows on them and some are within the lights. So I don't want to just go in and put the same line on all of them. So right in here, this one has a lot of contrast because it's kind of this shoulder separating from the rib cage. There's a deeper crease there. And then not as dark right here, still pretty sharp. There's a sharp line. And then in here, this is a lot more of a shadowy area, but it's not a very contrasty shadow. So I definitely want to make this a softer, kind of thicker line because I want to show that it's shadow, but not make it too heavy. And it's lighter up here. So you see how that kind of feels like a little shadow shape, whereas this feels like a sharp edge, the ending of the form, the ending of that shoulder. And it's because of the line quality. I'm not shading anything. It's just the type of line I'm putting down there is indicating all this stuff. Same thing in here. This shadow shape feels very soft, not too much contrast. So I'm gonna put a soft line in here. It's thick, so it definitely carries some weight, but it's not dark and it's not sharp. And then as I go back into these ribs, they're definitely getting smaller, so I can't make it that soft. Yeah, they're getting crisper, but I want to make sure I keep them light. If I make it dark, it's going to start competing with some of these other dark ones. Like these two are pretty dark. Okay, so see how that little variety adds some feeling of depth. Like there's actually organic forms in that rib cage, and it's not just stripes across the body, which that could definitely, I see maybe some of you probably going to be doing that. You know, your lines are going to start feeling like they're just stripes on the rhino. Maybe. I'm just assuming, because it's definitely an easy trap to fall into. And there's one little shape that I actually didn't map out for you guys. I don't know why I didn't, but it's right here. This really soft one. Kind of like that, because it continues this flow of these shapes inward like that. I keep wanting to put more of that contrast of the belly in here. There's a lot of contrast. There's a sharp highlight and a really deep shadow on that leg. I think the ending kind of snuck up on me here. I think we're almost done. A few little guys in here that are in the shadow. Yeah, and a few others that I missed in the head that I kind of wish I had in there, just to add some interesting shapes in there. It feels empty. And there's so many other wrinkles that I actually didn't map out for you guys. Like, I didn't want to put everything in. I wanted to set you up for some success and be picky with which lines we're including, which we're not. But that definitely was my own like artistic decisions there. You could certainly pick some more wrinkles and shapes in there that I did not include, and it'll be just as accurate, or just as correct as what I ended up doing. Okay, I think that's it. So we have this one for importance, right? A little bit flatter, but really nice to show the head is important, the horns are important, the legs are important. And then this one doesn't have that same separation of all the different elements, but definitely feels more like there's a light source coming in through here because, this leg is so light, all of this stuff is so light, it's kind of airy into the background, less contrast, and a lot heavier in the lines. And here does suggest more darks, right? That there's more, it feels like there's shadows there. And so it definitely feels like a light is shining onto the picture from this side. Yeah. Both look good to me. This is just a matter of preference. It's a matter of style and what you're trying to do. If you're not going to shade this thing, then maybe this, if you're going for more of a graphic feel, like you're going to make like some kind of sticker or something, or it's like on a sign at the zoo and you want a real strong statement immediately as you look, and it's gonna stay as lines, this is probably better. It's a much stronger statement immediately. But if you're gonna actually use these lines and you're gonna shade and you're gonna add values and shadows, this might be a better approach because it'll match the shadows and the lights, and it'll give off more of a feeling of light and atmosphere. So yeah, both work, and it depends on what you're trying to do. So yeah, thank you for watching. And if you feel like you did something that you want to improve on yours, do it again. Do it as many times as you need. You just keep printing these out, doing more variations of them. So cool. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next time.